guys, I wanted to make a quick video addressing the importance of not taking verses out of context. So for a very long time, as a little girl, when I read this particular passage of scripture, which I'll share to you in a moment, I had the impression that God had an unfavorable bias towards men, that God really didn't think much of women. And I just want to quickly read it for you and then we'll break it down. So the verse is Ecclesiastes 7, verse 28. Though I have searched repeatedly, I have not found what I was looking for. Only 1 out of 1,000 men is virtuous, but not one woman. What? When I read that, I was like, oh my goodness, this particular book in the Bible is written by one of the wisest men that ever lived. And if he says that he has lived and he hasn't met one virtuous woman, like what hope is there for me? Like what hope is there for me to be redeemed and saved? And this just points out the danger of taking a verse out of context and applying it to your life. It's so important that when we read the scriptures, we don't remain on the surface, that we delve and dig deeper and look at the history behind it and look at the context behind it so that you can get the full perspective of what the scripture is actually talking about. So let's just dissect this particular verse and let's look at the background and the history and the context behind it. So as I alluded to earlier on, we know that the book of Ecclesiastes was written by King Solomon. And we know that King Solomon basically wrote this book when he had come to the end of his life. And we know that it has kind of like a melancholic, he's sort of like in a depressive state as he's writing this book. And the other thing that we know is that King Solomon, you know, one of the things that made him fall from grace and drew him apart from God was the fact that he took many wives, and not only many wives, but he took foreign wives who didn't believe in God. So they led him away from God. So if you know this, then you know why Solomon is saying that he hasn't met one virtuous woman. Well, King Solomon, you weren't looking in the right places. Hello. You know, so that puts it into perspective. That will make you understand why the wisest man in the world would say this. Also, when you're reading a particular verse, it's very important to not just read the verse on its own. Read the verses preceding it and the verses after it. Because if we go back to this verse in verse 29, the one after the one I just read, Solomon says, "But I find this, God created people to be virtuous, but they have each turned to follow their own downward path." So you see here that Solomon isn't necessarily singling out women, but if you just take verse 28 on its own, it appears that way. It appears that way. So it's so important that we delve and dig a little bit deeper in the scripture so we can get the whole picture and the whole perspective, so we don't get distorted notions of what God is and who God is. Because when we take you know, a verse out of context, it becomes a pretext, and that, my friends, is very dangerous. So I hope this helped you. If anyone out there who was a bit uncomfortable with this particular passage in scripture. Bye.